in central Italy's volcanic hills, where iron ore lay buried beneath fertile soil and copper veins threaded through mountain ridges, a people emerged who would rule Rome before Rome ruled the world. They called themselves the Rasenna, though history remembers them by the Roman name, Etruscans. Around 1000 BC, small settlements dotted the landscape from the Arno River to the Tiber. These were the Villanovans, cremating their dead and placing ashes in ceramic urns shaped like miniature houses. At Tarquinia's Pian di Civita, metalworkers discovered that adding tin to copper created bronze, harder than either metal alone. Their workshops produced not just tools and weapons, but intricate fibulae decorated with geometric patterns that would become the foundation of Etruscan artistic tradition. The volcanic landscape that shaped their world was no accident of geography. Mount Amiata and the Colline Metallifere contained some of the richest mineral deposits in the ancient Mediterranean. Iron ore from Elba could be smelted into tools that stayed sharp longer than bronze. Silver from mountain valleys brought luxuries from distant lands. The earth itself promised wealth to those who knew how to extract it. Iron changed everything. Around 900 BC, Villanovan smiths mastered the complex process of smelting iron ore at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius. Unlike bronze, which required expensive tin imports, iron ore lay abundant in local hills. A farmer with an iron plough could break ground that had defeated bronze tools. Warriors carrying iron spears held decisive advantages over bronze-armed enemies. The transformation reshaped society within generations. Hilltop settlements expanded as agricultural surpluses fed growing populations. At Vigiai, excavations reveal a settlement that controlled iron mines stretching 15 kilometers into surrounding hills. The ruling families who controlled these resources accumulated wealth that set them apart from ordinary farmers and craftsmen. Burial practices tell the story of emerging social hierarchies. Early Villanovan graves contained simple pottery and bronze ornaments. By 850 BNZ, elite tombs at Tarquinia held elaborate bronze armor, imported Greek pottery, and gold jewelry crafted with techniques learned from Phoenician traders. Women's graves contained bronze mirrors, ivory combs, and amber beads that had traveled overland from the Baltic Sea, evidence of trade networks spanning Europe. These international connections brought more than luxury goods. Phoenician merchants sailing from Carthage established trading posts along the Italian coast, exchanging purple dye and exotic spices for Italian metals. Greek colonists founding cities in southern Italy introduced alphabet writing and artistic styles that local craftsmen adapted to their own traditions. The amber route connecting the Baltic to the Mediterranean passed directly through central Italian territories, making local rulers wealthy middlemen in Europe's most profitable trade network. The Rasenna occupied hilltop positions that commanded river valleys and mountain passes. Unlike their neighbors who built settlements in fertile lowlands, they chose defensible heights that offered both military security and divine approval. Lightning struck hilltops more frequently than valleys, a sign that sky gods favored elevated places. Each settlement controlled the agricultural land below, while maintaining independence from neighboring city-states. Religious practices centered on divination, reading divine will through natural signs. Lightning strikes carried messages from Tinia, the sky god. Birds flying in specific patterns revealed future events. The entrails of sacrificed animals displayed divine favor or displeasure with human actions. These beliefs required specialists who understood celestial movements, animal behavior, and ritual procedures. Priests accumulated both religious authority and political power as the only individuals capable of interpreting divine communication. Women held status unknown in most ancient societies. Tomb paintings show couples reclining together at banquets, women participating in religious ceremonies, and female figures holding obvious authority. The Lady Tanaquil, whose story would later scandalize Roman historians, represented traditions already centuries old by her time. Women owned property, conducted business, and influenced political decisions in ways that distinguished Ravenna society from the male-dominated cultures of Greece and early Rome. The question of ultimate origins remains unsolved, despite centuries of investigation. Herodotus claimed they migrated from Lydia during a great famine. Dionysius of Halicarnassus insisted they were indigenous Italians. Modern DNA analysis reveals a complex picture. The people buried in Etruscan tombs carried genetic markers from both local Italian populations and Eastern Mediterranean groups, suggesting migration and intermarriage rather than simple displacement. Their language provides the most intriguing clues. Unlike Latin, Greek, or Celtic tongues, Etruscan belonged to no known language family. Thousands of inscriptions survive, mostly tomb markers, religious dedications, and ritual texts. We can read individual words and understand basic grammar, but longer texts guard their secrets. The language's isolation suggests either very ancient origins or derivation from a tradition now completely extinct. The earliest Etruscan inscriptions date to around 700 BC, adapted from Greek alphabets but modified for local sounds and structures. Literacy remained limited to elite families initially, but writing transformed how knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Religious rituals, legal procedures, and historical events could now be recorded permanently instead of relying on oral tradition. Technological innovation accelerated throughout this period. The potter's wheel, arriving around 650 BC, revolutionized ceramic production. Wheeled vehicles transformed transportation possibilities. Advanced metallurgy produced stronger alloys and more sophisticated decorative techniques. Mathematical knowledge enabled architects to calculate load-bearing requirements for increasingly ambitious building projects. Settlement patterns reflected both practical needs and religious requirements. Temples faced east to catch the rising sun. City gates aligned with celestial observations. Public buildings occupied sacred spaces determined by ritual divination. The hilltop city of Veii grew to cover over 400 hectares, with massive defensive walls constructed from precisely fitted stone blocks weighing several tons each. Trade relationships extended across the known world. Etruscan bronzes reached markets in Spain and North Africa. Italian wine traveled to Greek symposiums and Celtic feasts. Amber from the Baltic Sea was carved into jewelry for Etruscan nobles. These commercial networks required sophisticated systems for standardizing weights, measures, and currency, innovations that would later influence Roman economic practices. Social stratification became increasingly pronounced as wealth concentrated among families, controlling mineral resources and international trade. Elite residences featured multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards, while ordinary citizens lived in single-room structures. Tomb architecture mirrored these distinctions. Aristocratic families built elaborate stone chambers, decorated with paintings and filled with luxury goods, while common graves contained simple pottery and personal ornaments. Military organization reflected social hierarchies. Elite warriors fought as heavily armed infantry, their bronze armor and iron weapons marking their status. Common soldiers served as light infantry or support troops. Warfare between neighboring settlements increased as competition for trade routes and mineral resources intensified. Fortifications became more sophisticated, featuring complex gate systems and overlapping defensive positions. Artistic traditions evolved rapidly during this formative period. Bronze work progressed from simple, functional objects to elaborate ceremonial pieces demonstrating both technical mastery and aesthetic vision. Pottery styles incorporated influences from Greek, Phoenician, and local traditions into distinctively Etruscan forms. Architecture developed characteristic features, including the distinctive three-room temple design, that would influence Roman building practices for centuries. Religious architecture assumed monumental proportions as settlements grew wealthier. Temple complexes served not just as places of worship, but as community centers where religious, political, and economic activities intersected. The Great Temple at Veii required precise engineering to support its massive roof structure without internal columns, a technical achievement that demonstrated both mathematical sophistication and religious devotion. By 800 BC, the foundations of Etruscan power were firmly established. Independent city-states controlled territories from the Arno to the Tiber. Specialized craftsmen produced goods that competed successfully in Mediterranean markets. Religious traditions had evolved into sophisticated systems for interpreting divine will and organizing human society. Trade networks connected Italian settlements with merchants from Spain to Syria. The hilltop villages that had begun as simple farming settlements were transforming into something unprecedented in Italian history. A confederation of wealthy, independent city-states whose influence would soon extend far beyond their volcanic homeland. Kings would rise to challenge the greatest powers of the ancient world. Armies would march south to conquer Greek colonies and north to control Alpine passes. Artists and architects would create works of enduring beauty and innovation. The stage was set for the next chapter, the emergence of the great cities that would make the name Etruscan synonymous with power, wealth, and cultural achievement throughout the ancient Mediterranean. The hilltop settlements that had grown rich from iron and commerce now transformed into something unprecedented in Italian history, a confederation of powerful city-states that would dominate the peninsula for centuries. What emerged was the Dodecapolis, the League of 12 centers that shared sacred traditions and cultural practices while maintaining fierce independence in politics and warfare. 12 major centers formed the sacred heart of Ravenna power, though the exact composition shifted over time as some settlements rose while others declined. Veii commanded the vital crossing points of the Tiber, its massive walls encompassing farmlands that could feed 100,000 inhabitants during sieges. Tarquinia controlled coastal shipping routes and boasted the richest tomb paintings in the ancient world, its necropolis containing over 6,000 decorated chambers carved into limestone cliffs. Cerveteri, known to its inhabitants as Caia, grew wealthy from its port at Pyrgi and dominated salt production along 60 kilometers of coastline. Volterra perched atop volcanic hills that contained copper mines, extending deep into underground galleries, their shafts reaching depths that would not be matched until medieval times. Populonia commanded the iron trade from Elba, its harbour bristling with cargo ships that transported processed metal throughout the Mediterranean. Roselle controlled river valleys that produced surplus grain for export markets. Chiusi dominated mountain passes that connected central Italy with Celtic lands beyond the Alps. Cortona ruled fertile agricultural districts that supplied wine to luxury markets across the known world. Arezzo controlled strategic road networks that linked Adriatic and Tyrrhenian coasts. Fiesole commanded river crossings that regulated movement between northern and central regions. Orvieto occupied volcanic plateaus that provided natural fortifications against any conceivable assault. The 12th member varied, depending on political circumstances and military fortunes. Sometimes Falerii joined the Sacred League through marriage alliances with established members. Occasionally, wealthy colonies like Capua in Campania claimed recognition based on their economic contributions to shared enterprises. The Confederation operated less as a fixed political structure than as a flexible alliance that adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles of mutual respect and shared identity. Political organization within each center followed similar patterns while allowing for local variations. Kings ruled through combinations of inherited authority, priestly sanction, and popular acceptance. Unlike the absolute monarchs emerging in Eastern Mediterranean kingdoms, Ravenna rulers governed through councils of nobles who retained significant independent power. These aristocratic assemblies controlled vast estates, commanded private armies, and influenced royal decisions through networks of kinship, marriage, and economic partnership. The Lucumones, as the Romans would later call these kings, derived legitimacy from their ability to interpret divine will and maintain cosmic harmony. Each ruler underwent elaborate coronation ceremonies that involved complex divination rituals designed to confirm divine approval. The king received sacred regalia, including the purple robe, ivory scepter, and golden crown that marked his special relationship with the gods. These symbols carried such powerful religious significance that Roman magistrates would later adopt them as marks of imperium. Beneath the aristocratic elite, a substantial middle class emerged that included successful merchants, skilled craftsmen, and professional soldiers. These citizens owned comfortable houses, commissioned modest tomb monuments, and participated in civic festivals without achieving the wealth and status of noble families. Their emergence reflected economic opportunities created by expanding commerce and technological innovation. A master potter could accumulate enough wealth to purchase land and slaves. A successful bronze worker might establish workshops that employed dozens of apprentices and specialists. Urban planning reached unprecedented sophistication as settlements expanded beyond their original defensive cores. Veii eventually encompassed over 400 hectares, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Its urban designers laid out residential districts according to grid patterns that separated aristocratic mansions from artisan workshops and commercial centers. Wide boulevards connected major gates with central temples and market squares. Secondary streets provided access to residential neighborhoods while maintaining proper relationships between sacred and secular spaces. Water management systems rivaled those of any contemporary civilization. Engineers designed elaborate drainage networks that channeled rainwater away from urban centers, while preventing erosion of hillside foundations. At Veii, workers carved tunnels through solid rock to divert the Cremera River and prevent seasonal flooding. These cuniculi extended for kilometers underground, requiring precise surveying techniques and sophisticated understanding of hydraulic principles. Some channels featured inspection shafts, ventilation systems, and maintenance access points that enabled repairs and modifications. Architectural innovations influenced building practices throughout the Mediterranean world. Temple designers developed the distinctive three-room layout that reflected theological principles about divine triads. The central cella housed the primary deity's statue, while flanking chambers accommodated associated gods and ritual equipment. Unlike Greek temples built entirely from stone, Ravenna sacred buildings used wooden frames that supported elaborate terracotta decorations. This technique allowed for more colorful ornamentation while reducing construction costs and completion times. The famous temple at Veii, dedicated to Minerva, demonstrated the artistic heights achieved through terracotta sculpture. The Apollo of Veii, created around 500 BC, showed the god striding forward with supernatural energy, his robes flowing in divine wind, his expression combining human beauty with otherworldly power. The figure's technical execution, from the precise modeling of musculature to the intricate details of drapery, rivaled the best Greek marble sculptures while achieving effects impossible in stone. Sacred architecture followed strict ritual requirements that governed everything, from foundation ceremonies to roof ornaments. Temples faced east to capture the rising sun, their entrance stairs oriented according to celestial observations. The ritual boundaries, known as the pomerium, defined sacred space through elaborate surveying procedures that involved augural interpretation of natural signs. These boundaries carried such spiritual significance that crossing them without proper authorization constituted a capital offense. Divination evolved into a comprehensive science that required decades of specialized training. The discipline of hierospasy involved reading divine messages inscribed in the entrails of sacrificial animals. Practitioners studied the liver's surface, noting variations in color, texture, and anatomical features that revealed divine intentions. A bronze liver discovered at Piacenza shows the complexity of this system, its surface divided into dozens of sections, each corresponding to specific deities and types of divine communication. Lightning interpretation followed equally sophisticated principles. Observers recorded the direction, timing, and characteristics of electrical storms, correlating these phenomena with subsequent events to develop predictive frameworks. The sky was divided into 16 regions, each governed by particular gods who used lightning to communicate approval, warning, or command. Thunder patterns, cloud formations, and associated weather phenomena all carried specific meanings that trained specialists could interpret. Bird augury required extensive knowledge of avian behavior and migration patterns. Different species conveyed different types of messages. Eagles represented royal authority, while owls signified wisdom or impending death. Flight directions, calling patterns, and feeding behaviors all provided information about divine intentions. The most skilled augurs could predict military outcomes, agricultural prospects, and political developments through careful observation of natural signs. These divination practices were codified in sacred books that preserved centuries of accumulated wisdom. The Libri Haruspicini detailed proper procedures for entrail reading. The Libri Fulgurales explained lightning interpretation. The Libri Rituales covered ceremonial requirements for various occasions. These texts represented some of the earliest systematic attempts to organize religious knowledge according to rational principles. Economic systems combined state management with private enterprise in ways that maximized both innovation and stability. Royal administrations controlled vast agricultural estates that employed thousands of dependent laborers. These workers lived in village communities scattered throughout the countryside, their obligations regulated by customary law that balanced royal demands with traditional rights. The estates produced grain, wine, olive oil, and livestock that supplied urban populations while generating surpluses for international markets. Textile production reached industrial scales in workshops that housed hundreds of female workers. These facilities produced fine fabrics using techniques learned from Phoenician and Greek craftsmen, but adapted to local materials and market demands. Wool from mountain sheep was processed into waterproof cloaks, suitable for Northern European customers. Linen from river valleys became luxury clothing for wealthy Mediterranean buyers. Silk, imported from distant Asia, was rewoven into garments that combined foreign materials with distinctively local designs. Metalworking centers achieved unprecedented productivity through technological innovations and specialized labor organization. Bronze foundries developed new alloy compositions that produced stronger, more durable products. Iron workshops mastered temperature control techniques that enabled the production of steel implements centuries before such methods became common elsewhere. Precious metal craftsmen created jewelry and decorative objects that demonstrated both technical mastery and artistic vision. Banking systems evolved to support increasingly complex commercial transactions. Wealthy families developed credit mechanisms that financed long-distance expeditions and seasonal agricultural activities. Interest rates varied according to risk assessments that considered factors like route safety, weather patterns, and political stability. Some institutions maintained offices in multiple centers, enabling merchants to access funds and transfer assets across territorial boundaries. Coinage revolutionized commercial relationships during the 7th century BC. The earliest Rasenna coins featured simple designs, often just royal symbols or divine images, but their standardized weights and guaranteed purity eliminated the need for complex weighing and testing procedures. Silver pieces facilitated high-value transactions, while bronze denominations enabled everyday purchases. Some centers developed distinctive monetary systems that reflected local resources and commercial priorities. Maritime commerce expanded dramatically as merchants established permanent outposts throughout the Western Mediterranean. Pyrgi, the port serving Cerveteri, became one of the busiest harbors in the ancient world. Its warehouses stored goods arriving from across the known world: Lebanese cedar, Spanish silver, African ivory, Celtic amber, and exotic spices from lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Harbor facilities included specialized docks for different types of vessels, covered storage areas that protected valuable cargoes from weather damage, and administrative buildings where customs officials recorded transactions and collected fees. Trading expeditions reached markets that Greek and Phoenician competitors had not yet penetrated. Rasenna sailors explored Atlantic coasts, establishing commercial relationships with Celtic tribes in southern France and eastern Spain. These northern connections proved especially valuable because they provided access to tin deposits essential for bronze production and amber sources that supplied Mediterranean luxury markets. Some expeditions may have reached Britain, though evidence for such contacts remains fragmentary. Overland commerce followed established routes that connected Italian centers with Alpine passes and European river systems. Merchants transported goods along carefully maintained roads that featured rest stations, defensive positions, and storage facilities. Pack animals carried high-value, low-weight items like metalwork and luxury textiles. Wheeled vehicles handled bulk commodities like grain and wine. These networks required diplomatic agreements with numerous tribal groups and political entities, creating relationships that extended Rasenna influence far beyond their territorial boundaries. Agricultural innovations supported larger populations while improving dietary quality and variety. Farmers developed sophisticated viticulture techniques that produced wines renowned for their flavor and keeping qualities. Different grape varieties were matched to specific soil types and microclimates, creating regional specializations that found distinct market niches. Olive cultivation expanded throughout territories previously considered marginal, using grafting techniques and soil improvement methods that increased both yield and product quality. Grain production incorporated new varieties and farming methods that reduced dependence on weather variations. Crop rotation systems maintained soil fertility while maximizing land use efficiency. Storage techniques preserved surpluses for multiple years, providing insurance against harvest failures and enabling strategic food distribution during emergencies. Some estates specialized in producing particular crops for export markets, creating agricultural systems that resembled modern commercial farming operations. Artistic traditions flourished as prosperity provided resources for cultural patronage and international exchange. Bronze working achieved unprecedented sophistication through innovations in casting techniques, alloy composition, and decorative methods. The famous Capitoline wolf, though its dating remains controversial, exemplifies the expressive power achieved by Ravenna metalworkers. The creature's muscular tension, alert expression, and protective stance toward the legendary twins capture both naturalistic observation and symbolic meaning. Pottery production underwent revolutionary changes with the development of bucchero, a distinctive black ceramic that became synonymous with Ravenna craftsmanship. This technique involved sophisticated firing procedures that created lustrous surfaces without requiring expensive glazes. Bucchero vessels featured elegant forms and subtle decorations that appealed to both domestic and foreign buyers. The finest examples combined technical perfection with artistic vision, creating works that functioned as both practical objects and aesthetic statements. Wall painting reached artistic heights that would not be equaled in Western Europe for over a millennium. Tomb decorations depicted scenes of daily life, ceremonial events, and mythological narratives with remarkable skill and imagination. The Tomb of the Leopards at Tarquinia shows banqueters reclining on couches, while musicians provide entertainment and servants offer food and wine. The figures display individual personalities and emotions, their gestures and expressions capturing moments of genuine human interaction. These paintings provide invaluable insights into social customs and cultural values. Men and women dine together as equals, participating in conversations and ceremonial activities without the gender segregation common in Greek and Roman society. Servants and slaves appear as individuals rather than anonymous laborers, some clearly holding positions of trust and responsibility. Athletic competitions, musical performances, and religious ceremonies receive equal attention, suggesting a culture that valued both physical achievement and artistic expression. Sculpture achieved impressive technical and artistic standards, despite working primarily in terracotta rather than stone. The medium's flexibility enabled artists to create dynamic compositions impossible in marble or bronze. Divine figures stride forward with supernatural energy, their robes flowing in otherworldly winds, their expressions combining human emotions with divine authority. Portrait sculpture captured individual characteristics while maintaining idealized beauty, creating works that functioned as both artistic statements and religious objects. Social organization became increasingly stratified as communities grew larger and economic opportunities expanded. At the apex stood royal families whose authority derived from combinations of inherited status, religious sanction, and popular acceptance. These rulers controlled vast resources through networks of kinship, marriage, and political alliance. Royal women enjoyed particularly elevated status, often ruling as regents for underage sons, or wielding independent political authority through their own achievements and connections. The case of Tanaquil illustrates the power that elite women could achieve. Originally from Tarquinia, she married Lucius Tarquinius and played a crucial role in his rise to power in Rome. Ancient sources credit her with engineering her husband's succession to the throne and later ensuring that her son-in-law inherited royal authority. Her influence operated through a combination of political intelligence, religious expertise, and aristocratic connections that enabled her to shape events across multiple generations. Below the royal elite, noble families controlled substantial estates, commanded private armies, and maintained hereditary relationships with client families. These aristocrats competed for royal favor and political influence while pursuing independent economic activities. Some specialized in particular sectors. Certain families dominated metalworking, others controlled agricultural production, still others focused on long-distance commerce. Competition among noble houses provided internal dynamic that drove innovation while maintaining social stability through established customs and mutual obligations. Military organization reflected social hierarchies while adapting to changing tactical requirements and technological innovations. Elite warriors fought as heavily armed infantry, their bronze armor and iron weapons marking aristocratic status while providing practical protection. These fighters received extensive training in individual combat techniques and group formations. Their equipment included bronze helmets decorated with religious symbols, body armor that covered torso and limbs, shields that featured family emblems, and weapons that demonstrated both craftsmanship and functionality. Common soldiers served in supporting roles that proved equally essential to military success. Light infantry provided mobility and flexibility that heavy formations lacked. Archers delivered accurate fire at distances beyond spear range. Cavalry units offered reconnaissance capabilities and rapid response to changing battlefield conditions. Siege specialists operated equipment that enabled attacks on fortified positions. This military system balanced aristocratic leadership with broadly distributed participation, creating armies that combined social solidarity with tactical effectiveness. Fortification systems became increasingly sophisticated as competition intensified and siege techniques advanced. The massive walls of Vai incorporated multiple defensive lines, complex gate systems, and siege-resistant construction techniques that could withstand prolonged assault. These fortifications used precisely fitted stone blocks that required no mortar, creating walls that remained stable for centuries while providing platforms for defensive artillery. Gate systems featured overlapping approaches that exposed attackers to crossfire while protecting defenders behind reinforced positions. Defensive planning integrated natural topography with artificial construction to create virtually impregnable positions. Hilltop locations provided inherent advantages that engineering enhanced through careful design. Steep approaches channeled enemy forces into predetermined killing zones where defenders could concentrate their firepower. Water supplies within defensive perimeters enabled communities to withstand extended sieges. Storage facilities preserved food and military equipment for years of emergency use. Cultural achievements extended far beyond material arts to encompass literature, music, philosophy, and scientific inquiry. Though few Ravenna texts survive, contemporary references suggest rich traditions of sacred poetry, historical chronicles, and dramatic performances. These works apparently addressed themes of divine justice, heroic achievement, and moral instruction through narratives that combined entertainment with education. Some compositions achieved sufficient reputation to influence Greek and Roman literary traditions. Musical traditions incorporated influences from across the Mediterranean while developing distinctively local characteristics. Instruments found in tombs include lyres, flutes, trumpets, and percussion devices that indicate sophisticated understanding of harmony, rhythm, and musical structure. Some performances apparently combined vocal and instrumental elements in complex arrangements that required trained specialists and coordinated preparation. Music played essential roles in religious ceremonies, social celebrations, and theatrical presentations. Mathematical knowledge enabled accurate surveying, precise architectural calculations, and complex astronomical observations that supported both practical activities and religious requirements. Surveyors could lay out urban districts according to grid patterns that maintained proper proportional relationships. Architects calculated load-bearing requirements for ambitious construction projects that pushed contemporary engineering to its limits. Astronomers tracked celestial movements that provided calendrical information and religious guidance. International relationships operated according to established diplomatic protocols that recognized sovereign equality among major powers, while accommodating practical inequalities of wealth and military strength. Marriage alliances cemented political agreements between ruling families, creating networks of kinship that transcended territorial boundaries. These arrangements often involved elaborate negotiations about dowries, inheritance rights, and mutual obligations that could extend across multiple generations. Commercial treaties regulated business relationships and established procedures for resolving disputes through arbitration rather than warfare. These agreements addressed issues like currency exchange rates, quality standards for traded goods, and legal procedures for dealing with commercial conflicts. Some treaties included provisions for mutual defense against common enemies, or coordinated responses to threats like piracy and tribal raids. Cultural exchanges brought foreign artists, craftsmen, and scholars to Ravenna courts while sending Italian specialists to distant lands. These relationships facilitated technological transfer, artistic innovation, and intellectual development that enriched all participating cultures. Greek artists learned terracotta techniques that they adapted to their own traditions. Ravenna metalworkers incorporated decorative motifs from Egyptian and Near Eastern sources. Phoenician merchants introduced commercial practices that influenced local business methods. Sacred festivals provided regular opportunities for inter-community cooperation and cultural display. The annual gathering at the sanctuary of Voltumna brought representatives from all 12 major centers to participate in religious ceremonies, athletic competitions, and political discussions. These events reinforced shared identity while allowing individual communities to demonstrate their wealth and achievements through elaborate processions, costly offerings, and artistic presentations. Athletic competitions included events that tested both individual skill and team coordination. Chariot racing required expensive equipment and extensive training that only wealthy families could afford. Wrestling and boxing matches demonstrated personal prowess and physical courage. Running and jumping contests appealed to broader participation while maintaining standards of excellence. These activities provided entertainment while serving social functions that strengthened community bonds and established hierarchies of achievement. Political discussions at these festivals addressed common concerns like military threats, commercial disputes, and religious obligations. Though each community maintained independence, the Confederation provided mechanisms for coordinating responses to shared challenges. Diplomatic marriages, military alliances, and commercial agreements often emerged from these gatherings through negotiations that balanced local interests with collective needs. By 600 BC, the Confederation had achieved unprecedented prosperity and cultural sophistication that positioned it among the major powers of the ancient Mediterranean world. The 12 centers controlled territories extending from the Po Valley to Campania, their influence reaching from Celtic lands beyond the Alps to Greek colonies in southern Italy. Their merchants conducted business from Atlantic Iberia to Syrian ports, their goods competing successfully with products from the most advanced workshops of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Political institutions balanced local autonomy with cooperative coordination in ways that fostered both innovation and stability. Economic systems combined state management with private enterprise to maximize productivity while maintaining social solidarity. Religious traditions had evolved into sophisticated theological frameworks that would influence Roman practices for centuries. Military organizations provided effective defense while enabling territorial expansion when opportunities arose. The hilltop settlements that had begun as simple farming villages now ruled territories larger than many contemporary kingdoms, their cultural achievements inspiring admiration and envy throughout the known world. Their confederation was entering its golden age, ready to challenge the greatest powers of the ancient Mediterranean, while maintaining the distinctive character that set them apart from both Greek democracy and Eastern despotism. The stage was set for the next chapter of expansion and cultural flowering that would carry Ravenna influence from the edges of the civilized world to the very heart of what would become the Roman Empire. The confederation that had emerged from volcanic hills now commanded the central Mediterranean like a colossus. During these crucial decades, fleets controlled sea routes from Corsica to Sicily, while armies marched south into Campania and north toward the Alps. Most remarkably, their kings ruled the Latin settlement of the Seven Hills, transforming a modest tribal center into the foundation of future empire. Naval supremacy in the Tyrrhenian Sea marked the beginning of this golden age. Warships patrolled waters that stretched from the Rhone Delta to the Bay of Naples, their bronze-reinforced prows cutting through waves that carried the wealth of nations. These vessels represented marvels of contemporary shipbuilding, sleek galleys powered by crews of trained oarsmen, their holds designed to carry both warriors and cargo across distances that had once seemed impossible. The battle for Corsica demonstrated the sophisticated naval tactics that made this dominance possible. Around 560 BC, commanders coordinated with Carthaginian allies to challenge Hellenic expansion in the western Mediterranean. The engagement off Alalia pitted Hellenic Pentacontas against the combined fleets of two maritime powers determined to maintain their spheres of influence. Though Hellenic sources claimed victory, the strategic outcome favored the allies. Corsica remained under Italian control, while Carthaginian influence extended into Sardinia. This victory established the principle of shared Mediterranean hegemony that would govern international relations for the next century. Italian fleets dominated the northern waters, controlling shipping routes between France and the peninsula, while maintaining access to Celtic markets beyond the Alps. Carthaginian vessels commanded southern approaches, their merchants carrying African goods to European buyers, while preventing Hellenic expansion westward. This division produced stability that benefited both powers through increased commerce and reduced military expenditure. Maritime technology advanced rapidly as competition intensified between major naval powers. Shipyards developed innovations in hull design that increased both speed and cargo capacity. Bronze fittings protected vulnerable areas from ramming attacks while providing mounting points for defensive equipment. Specialized vessel types emerged for different purposes: fast scout ships for reconnaissance, heavily armed warships for battle, and broad-hulled merchantmen for carrying bulk cargoes across extended distances. Navigation methods incorporated both practical experience and divine guidance. Captains used coastal landmarks, star positions, and seasonal wind patterns to plot courses across open water. Sacred rituals preceded dangerous voyages, with priests performing divination ceremonies that determined auspicious departure dates and appropriate offerings to sea deities. The bronze liver from Piacenza includes maritime zones that show how naval operations were integrated into the broader framework of divine communication. Expansion into Campania represented perhaps the most dramatic achievement of this period. Armies crossed the mountainous barriers that separated central Italy from the fertile plains surrounding modern Naples, establishing control over territories that would become some of the wealthiest regions in the ancient world. This southern expansion brought them into direct contact with Hellenic colonies that had been established for centuries, setting up both opportunities for cultural exchange and sources of perpetual conflict. Capua emerged as the crown jewel of this southern empire. Founded around 600 BC, the settlement grew rapidly through strategic advantages that combined fertile agricultural land with crucial transportation networks. The Volturno River provided access to interior regions while connecting to coastal ports that served Mediterranean shipping. Local soil proved ideal for grain production, viticulture, and olive cultivation that generated agricultural surpluses capable of supporting substantial urban populations. The new colony attracted settlers from throughout central Italian territories, producing a cosmopolitan population that blended traditions from multiple centers. Aristocratic families from Tarquinia, Cerveteri, and Veii established estates that reproduced the social hierarchies of their homeland while adapting to local conditions. Craftsmen brought specialized skills in metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacturing that established industries serving both regional markets and long-distance exports. Cultural synthesis in Campania produced innovations that influenced artistic development throughout the peninsula. Local workshops combined Italian methods with Hellenic aesthetic principles, developing hybrid styles that appealed to diverse customers. Bronze work incorporated decorative motifs from multiple traditions while maintaining distinctive characteristics that marked products as distinctively Italian. Pottery production adopted Hellenic forms while developing unique glazing approaches that produced colors and textures unavailable elsewhere. The relationship with existing Hellenic colonies required delicate diplomatic balancing that combined military pressure with commercial cooperation. Some settlements accepted Italian hegemony in exchange for protection and trading privileges. Others resisted through alliances with distant Hellenic powers or local tribal groups. These conflicts produced the military innovations and tactical developments that would later enable conquest throughout the Mediterranean world. Siege warfare reached new levels of sophistication as commanders encountered the heavily fortified Hellenic settlements of the south. Engineers developed specialized equipment for attacking stone walls that had previously seemed impregnable. Battering rams, protected by bronze-covered frames, could breach defensive gates despite concentrated defensive fire. Siege towers provided elevated platforms that enabled assault troops to reach wall tops while maintaining protection from enemy missiles. The conquest of Hellenic settlements brought exposure to military methods that revolutionized tactical thinking. The hoplite phalanx, with its disciplined formations of heavily armored spearmen, proved superior to traditional Italian fighting styles that emphasized individual prowess over coordinated group action. Adaptation of these formations required extensive training programs and equipment modifications that transformed the nature of warfare throughout central Italy. Simultaneously, northern expansion extended influence into the Po Valley and Alpine foothills, establishing a territorial empire that stretched from sea to sea across the Italian peninsula. These campaigns involved different challenges from the southern wars. Instead of confronting established Hellenic colonies, northern armies encountered Celtic tribes whose fighting methods emphasized mobility, individual courage, and psychological intimidation over disciplined formations. Celtic warfare relied heavily on shock tactics designed to break enemy morale through terrifying displays of ferocity. Warriors painted their bodies with blue dye, braided their hair into intimidating styles, and charged into battle while screaming war cries intended to paralyze opponents with fear. Their weapons included long swords designed for slashing attacks, decorative shields that doubled as offensive weapons, and javelins that could penetrate armor at considerable distances. Adaptation to Celtic tactics required commanders to develop flexible formations that could respond rapidly to unexpected maneuvers while maintaining enough cohesion to resist determined charges. Light infantry units provided mobility that matched Celtic skirmishers. Cavalry forces offered pursuit capabilities that could exploit successful defensive actions. Psychological warfare countered Celtic intimidation through ceremonies that demonstrated divine support for Italian arms. Northern expansion brought access to valuable resources that complemented existing economic advantages. Alpine regions contained silver deposits that enhanced monetary systems and provided materials for luxury goods. Mountain forests supplied timber for shipbuilding and construction projects that had previously required expensive imports. Pastoral areas produced wool and hides that supported expanding textile industries. Celtic societies possessed metallurgical skills that in some areas exceeded Italian capabilities, particularly in iron-working methods that produced superior weapons and tools. Cultural exchange through conquest and alliance brought these innovations south, while introducing Mediterranean agricultural practices and artistic traditions to northern populations. This synthesis produced hybrid cultures that combined the best elements of both civilizations. The most remarkable achievement of this expansionist period was the establishment of rule over the Latin settlement itself. The transformation of this modest tribal center into a major power base represented one of the most significant political developments in ancient history, establishing the foundation upon which future greatness would be built. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the first king from Tarquinia to rule the Seven Hills, arrived in the Latin settlement around 620 BC under circumstances that illustrated the complex social mobility that characterized the period. Originally from the coastal center, he represented the ambitious aristocratic families who sought opportunities beyond their traditional territories. His wife Tanaquil possessed the spiritual knowledge and political connections that enabled their rise to power through a combination of wealth, divine sanction, and popular support. The reign of Tarquinius Priscus introduced urban planning concepts that would transform the settlement from a collection of hilltop villages into a unified metropolitan center. Engineers drained the marshy areas between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, establishing the forum that would become the political and commercial heart of the expanding community. This massive project required sophisticated hydraulic engineering that channeled water through underground drainage systems while providing solid foundations for permanent construction. Construction of the Circus Maximus demonstrated the scale of ambition that rulers brought to their new capital. This enormous entertainment venue could accommodate over 250,000 spectators, making it one of the largest structures in the ancient world. The engineering challenges involved in developing stable seating areas, efficient crowd flow systems, and adequate drainage facilities required mathematical calculations and construction methods that pushed contemporary technology to its limits. Temple construction during this period established architectural precedents that would influence building for centuries. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill, followed traditional design principles, while incorporating innovations that reflected the settlement's growing importance. The three-room layout honored the divine triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, while providing space for the ceremonies that legitimized royal authority. Spiritual practices introduced from Etruria fundamentally transformed Latin cultural life in ways that would persist long after political independence was achieved. The practice of augury, interpreting divine will through natural signs, became central to governmental decision-making. No important action could be undertaken without consulting the auspices, and priests trained in traditional methods held responsibility for maintaining proper relationships between human and divine realms. The institution of the triumph represented perhaps the most dramatic example of cultural transfer from Etruria to the Latin settlement. This elaborate ceremony, celebrating military victory, incorporated spiritual elements, political symbolism, and theatrical display in ways that demonstrated the victor's special relationship with divine forces. The triumphator wore purple robes and a golden crown that marked his temporary elevation to near-divine status, while parading through streets lined with cheering crowds and defeated enemies. Servius Tullius, the second king from Etruria to rule the Seven Hills, implemented administrative reforms that established the foundation of later governmental systems. His census procedures developed systematic methods for recording population, assessing wealth, and organizing military service based on economic capability rather than traditional social status. This innovation enabled more efficient resource mobilization, while providing opportunities for social advancement based on achievement rather than birth. The Servian Wall, constructed during his reign, demonstrated the engineering capabilities that rulers brought to urban development. This massive fortification system enclosed all 7 hills within a defensive perimeter that could withstand assault by any contemporary army. The wall incorporated sophisticated architectural features, including multiple defensive lines, complex gate systems, and provisions for siege defense that reflected centuries of military experience. Constitutional innovations during this period established precedents that would influence law for centuries. The concept of imperium, supreme governmental authority, derived from political traditions that balanced royal power with aristocratic influence and popular participation. Legal procedures incorporated divination practices that ensured divine approval for human decisions, while providing mechanisms for resolving disputes through systematic rather than arbitrary methods. Economic development under this rule transformed the settlement from a modest agricultural community into a major commercial center that attracted merchants from throughout the Mediterranean world. The Forum Boarium became a bustling marketplace where traders exchanged goods ranging from Celtic amber to Egyptian papyrus. Harbor facilities at the mouth of the Tiber accommodated increasing numbers of cargo ships that brought luxury items while exporting local products to distant markets. Cultural achievements during this period reflected the cosmopolitan character that rule brought to central Italy. Artists working in the expanding settlement had access to materials, approaches, and aesthetic traditions from across the known world. The Apollo of Veii, designed for the Portonaccio temple, exemplified the dynamic style that combined spiritual devotion with artistic innovation. The figure's forward stride and flowing robes conveyed supernatural energy while maintaining the naturalistic details that mark the best contemporary sculpture. Wall painting traditions that had developed in centers found new expression in Latin contexts, while adapting to local preferences and conditions. Tomb decorations in the settlement began incorporating the narrative themes and sophisticated approaches that had made Tarquinian painting famous throughout the ancient world. These works provided models for later artists, while preserving visual records of social customs and spiritual practices. Architecture during this period established design principles that would characterize building for centuries. The combination of functional engineering with aesthetic consideration produced structures that served practical needs while making powerful symbolic statements about the community's wealth, sophistication, and divine favor. Public buildings incorporated proportional relationships derived from spiritual principles, while providing the spaces necessary for governmental, commercial, and social activities. The drainage system constructed during this period represented one of the most significant engineering achievements in ancient urban development. The Cloaca Maxima channeled wastewater and storm runoff through underground tunnels that prevented the flooding and disease problems that plagued many contemporary settlements. This system required precise surveying, sophisticated construction methods, and ongoing maintenance programs that demonstrated the administrative capabilities of governance. Social transformation accompanied political and economic development as the settlement attracted immigrants from throughout central Italy and beyond. Hellenic merchants established permanent residences that produced multicultural neighborhoods. Celtic craftsmen brought specialized skills that enhanced local production capabilities. Phoenician traders introduced commercial approaches and international connections that expanded economic opportunities. Women in the ruled settlement enjoyed freedoms that distinguished them from their counterparts in most contemporary societies. They participated in public ceremonies, conducted business transactions, and influenced political decisions through networks of family and patronage relationships. Aristocratic women like Tanaquil wielded substantial behind-the-scenes power, while women from lower social classes operated shops, managed households, and participated in activities with considerable independence. Military developments during this period established the institutional foundations that would later enable conquest of the Mediterranean world. The centuriate system organized citizens for military service based on wealth and equipment capability rather than traditional tribal affiliations. This innovation enabled more efficient mobilization while providing advancement opportunities for successful soldiers regardless of their family backgrounds. Weapons technology advanced significantly through contact with various cultures encountered during territorial expansion. Iron working methods improved through Celtic influences, while maintaining the decorative traditions that marked elite equipment. Defensive armor incorporated innovations from Hellenic sources, while adapting designs to tactical requirements. Siege equipment developed for campaigns against fortified positions established engineering capabilities that would prove essential in later conquests. International relationships during the height of power operated according to sophisticated diplomatic protocols that balanced competition with cooperation in ways that maintained general stability while allowing for territorial adjustments. Alliance systems connected major powers through networks of mutual obligation and shared interest that prevented any single state from achieving overwhelming dominance. The relationship with Carthage exemplified the complex balancing acts that characterized international politics during this period. Both powers benefited from their naval cooperation against Hellenic expansion, but competition for markets and territorial influence produced ongoing tensions that required careful management. Diplomatic marriages, commercial agreements, and military coordination provided mechanisms for addressing conflicts while maintaining the fundamental alliance. Hellenic responses to expansion varied depending on local circumstances and strategic calculations. Some colonies accepted tributary relationships in exchange for protection and trading privileges. Others sought support from distant Hellenic powers, or formed alliances with neighboring communities. These varied responses reflected the fragmented nature of Hellenic political organization that contrasted sharply with the coordinated policies of the Italian Confederation. Cultural exchange during this period of expansion established hybrid traditions that enriched all participating civilizations. Artists incorporated Hellenic mythological themes while maintaining distinctive stylistic characteristics. Hellenic craftsmen adopted Italian technical innovations while preserving their own aesthetic principles. The resulting synthesis produced artistic achievements that transcended the limitations of any single cultural tradition. Spiritual syncretism reflected the practical requirements of governing diverse populations while maintaining divine legitimacy. Italian deities were identified with Hellenic and Latin counterparts through theological interpretations that emphasized shared functions rather than surface differences. This approach enabled the incorporation of local traditions while maintaining the fundamental structures that supported political authority. By 500 BC, power had reached its greatest territorial extent and cultural influence. Fleets controlled the western Mediterranean, while armies dominated the Italian peninsula, from the Alps to Campania. The settlement on 7 hills had grown from a modest Latin community into a major power center that would soon eclipse its founders. The Confederation had achieved a level of prosperity and sophistication that rivaled the greatest powers of the ancient world. Yet beneath this impressive facade, internal tensions and external pressures were developing conditions that would soon challenge the foundations of dominance. Hellenic powers in the east were organizing more effective resistance to territorial expansion. Celtic tribes in the north were developing military capabilities that threatened frontier security. Most ominously, the very success of civilization was establishing conditions that would enable their former subjects to challenge their continued supremacy. The transformation of the Latin settlement under rule had established a power center whose ambitions would soon exceed its willingness to accept subordinate status. The military innovations, administrative systems, and cultural achievements that had been introduced by kings provided the foundation for future greatness, while establishing the instruments that would ultimately be turned against their creators. The Golden Age was approaching its end, though few contemporary observers could have predicted the dramatic reversals that lay ahead. The stage was set for the next chapter of this remarkable story: the expulsion of the last king from the 7 hills and the beginning of a republican system that would eventually consume the very civilization that had fostered it. The heights of power that had seemed so secure would prove vulnerable to the forces of change that success itself had set in motion. The year 509 BC shattered the foundations of central peninsular dominance, with an event that would echo through history for millennia. In the settlement on 7 hills that had grown great under rulers from Tarquinia and Cerveteri, a revolution erupted that would transform not just one city, but the entire Mediterranean world. The expulsion of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus marked the end of an era and the beginning of upheavals that would ultimately consume their creators. The final king's downfall began not with battlefield defeat, but with a scandal that exposed the fundamental tensions between traditional Confederation values and royal absolutism. The rape of Lucretia by the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, provided the spark that ignited long-simmering resentments among Latin aristocrats who had grown weary of foreign rule. The incident revealed how far the monarchy had drifted from the consensual governance that characterized the original league. Lucretia's suicide, performed according to ancient customs that demanded death before dishonor, became a rallying cry for revolution. Her kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus, who had concealed his intelligence behind a facade of foolishness to survive the king's suspicions, emerged as the leader of a conspiracy that included the most influential families in the settlement. These men possessed both the armed capability and social connections necessary to challenge royal authority. The revolution succeeded not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through a carefully orchestrated campaign that isolated the king from his sources of support. While Tarquinius Superbus was besieging Ardea, the conspirators seized control of the settlement's gates, treasury, and sacred institutions. They declared the monarchy abolished and established a new form of government based on shared authority among elected magistrates who would serve limited terms under the supervision of a citizen assembly. The establishment of the Republic represented a fundamental break with the monarchical traditions that had governed peninsular affairs for centuries. 2 consuls, elected annually, shared the executive authority that had previously belonged to kings. The Senate, composed of former magistrates and distinguished citizens, provided continuity and experience in governmental affairs. Popular assemblies retained the right to approve major decisions and elect officials, producing a system of checks and balances that prevented any individual from accumulating excessive control. This constitutional innovation drew heavily on the governmental traditions of the Confederation, while adapting them to local circumstances and revolutionary ideologies. The principle of collegiality, sharing authority among multiple officials, reflected the cooperative governance that had enabled the 12 centers to maintain their independence while participating in joint enterprises. The concept of limited terms prevented the emergence of hereditary dynasties that might threaten the new system's survival. Yet the revolution's success depended ultimately on armed capability rather than constitutional theory. The expelled king retained substantial support among Confederation centers that viewed the radical experiment as a dangerous precedent threatening established hierarchies. Tarquinius Superbus sought assistance from Lars Porsena of Clusium, one of the most formidable rulers in central Italy, who recognized that revolutionary ideology posed an existential threat to monarchical legitimacy throughout the region. Porsena's siege of the settlement represented the most serious challenge the new republic faced during its early years. The Clusian army was commanded by an experienced general who understood both siege warfare and the psychological factors that determined urban resistance. His armies controlled the surrounding countryside, cutting off supply lines and preventing the movement of reinforcements that might break the blockade. The siege produced legendary episodes of civic heroism that would inspire later generations, while revealing the determination that enabled the new system to survive its most vulnerable period. Horatius Cocles defended the Sublician Bridge against overwhelming odds, allowing the structure to be destroyed before enemy armies could cross the Tiber. Gaius Mucius Scaevola infiltrated the enemy camp in an assassination attempt that failed, but demonstrated revolutionary willingness to sacrifice everything for independence. These individual acts of courage reflected broader social transformation that accompanied the governmental revolution. The new system demanded higher levels of citizen participation than monarchical rule had required. Every male citizen became a potential soldier, whose service earned him the right to vote on matters of war and peace. Advancement depended on demonstrated competence and popular support, rather than royal favor or inherited status. Economic policies implemented by the early republic reflected both practical necessities and ideological commitments to civic equality. Land distribution programs provided small farms for citizens who had previously worked as tenants on royal estates. Commercial regulations protected local merchants against unfair competition, while encouraging the trade relationships that sustained urban prosperity. Tax systems spread financial burdens more equitably, while generating revenues needed for defense and public works. The struggle for independence forced rapid tactical innovations that would prove essential to later conquest. The citizen-soldier ideal replaced the professional armies that had served monarchical rulers, developing units whose motivation derived from defense of home and family, rather than financial reward. Organization adapted Greek hoplite formations to peninsular conditions, while maintaining the flexibility needed for varied tactical situations. Diplomatic policies initially focused on survival rather than conquest, seeking alliances with communities that shared concerns about monarchical restoration. Treaties with neighboring Latin settlements provided mutual defense guarantees, while establishing principles of legal equality that contrasted sharply with the tributary relationships imposed by royal governments. These agreements produced precedents for the federal systems that would later enable territorial growth across the peninsula. However, the very success of the revolutionary experiment intensified conflicts with the remaining Confederation kingdoms that correctly perceived radical ideology as a mortal threat to their own legitimacy. The loss of their most important colony undermined the prestige and practical authority of the League, encouraging subject populations to question the inevitability of monarchical rule while providing a successful model for alternative organization. Internal divisions within the Confederation weakened coordinated responses to the challenge from the Seven Hills. Individual centers pursued conflicting policies based on their particular circumstances and interests rather than collective strategic planning. Some rulers sought accommodation with the new republic through commercial agreements and diplomatic recognition. Others demanded armed action to restore monarchical authority and prevent the spread of revolutionary ideas. The Battle of Lake Regillus, around 496 BC, marked a crucial turning point in the struggle between the new system and monarchical restoration efforts. The engagement pitted legions against a coalition of Latin centers, supported by exiled members of the Tarquin family, who sought restoration through battlefield victory. The triumph demonstrated that citizen armies could defeat professional troops while establishing martial reputation that would prove essential to future growth. Simultaneously, developments in southern territories posed new challenges that would ultimately prove more serious than the immediate threats posed by royal restoration attempts. The prosperous colonies established during the previous century's growth faced increasing pressure from Greek settlements that had grown stronger through immigration and alliance formation. Competition for agricultural land, commercial markets, and influence produced conflicts that exposed the vulnerability of extended territorial holdings. The Greek colonies in Magna Graecia had undergone significant transformation since their initial establishment centuries earlier. Population growth through continued immigration from the eastern Mediterranean had strengthened their martial capabilities, while cultural development had produced sophisticated institutions and impressive artistic achievements. Centers like Syracuse, Tarentum, and Croton commanded substantial resources and possessed the naval capabilities necessary for coordinated action. Syracusan growth under the tyrant Jalon represented a particularly serious threat to Confederation interests in the south. This ambitious ruler had unified much of Sicily under his control, while building a formidable navy that challenged traditional dominance in the western waters. His alliance systems extended throughout Magna Graecia, producing a coalition capable of mounting sustained campaigns against Confederation colonies in Campania and other regions. The economic foundations of southern territories began eroding as Greek competition disrupted established trade relationships and warfare expenses, consumed resources that had previously supported development programs. Capua and other colonies found themselves increasingly isolated from their homeland support, while facing local populations who viewed Greek rule as potentially preferable to continued Confederation dominance. Cultural factors also played important roles in undermining Confederation control of southern regions. Greek colonies possessed prestige, derived from their connections to the classical traditions that were gaining influence throughout the known world. Their educational systems, artistic achievements, and philosophical developments attracted local elites who had previously supported Confederation rule, but now questioned whether continued association served their interests. The most devastating blow to Confederation authority in the south came with the naval defeat at Cumae in 474 BC. This engagement represented the culmination of years of increasing Greek pressure on maritime dominance, bringing together Syracuse's naval expertise with coordinated land-based support from mainland colonies. The battle's outcome would reshape the balance of authority throughout the Western waters, while marking the beginning of irreversible decline in Confederation influence. Syracusan preparations for the confrontation demonstrated the sophisticated planning capabilities that characterized Greek organization. Gelon's admirals had studied Confederation naval tactics through years of observation and limited engagement, identifying weaknesses in ship design, crew training, and operational procedures that could be exploited through superior preparation and coordination. The Syracusan fleet incorporated technological innovations that provided advantages in speed, maneuverability, and fighting capability. The battle itself unfolded according to Greek strategic planning that used deception and tactical flexibility to overcome Confederation numerical advantages. Syracusan commanders feigned retreat to draw Confederation vessels away from their supporting positions, then executed coordinated attacks that isolated enemy ships and prevented effective mutual support. Superior seamanship and crew training enabled Greek units to maintain formation discipline, while exploiting tactical opportunities that arose during the engagement. The defeat's consequences extended far beyond the immediate loss of ships and experienced sailors. Naval supremacy in the Western waters, which had provided the foundation for territorial growth and commercial dominance, collapsed with stunning suddenness. Trade routes that had generated prosperity for decades fell under Greek control, disrupting economic relationships and demanding painful adjustments throughout Confederation territories. Psychological impact proved equally damaging to long-term Confederation prospects. The aura of invincibility that had supported territorial growth and diplomatic influence disappeared, with the demonstration that Confederation fleets could be decisively defeated by determined opposition. Subject populations throughout the empire began questioning the wisdom of continued association with a league that could no longer guarantee protection or prosperity. The battle's aftermath revealed the fundamental weaknesses that had developed within the Confederation during its period of greatest territorial growth. Individual centers proved incapable of coordinating effective responses to strategic challenges, pursuing conflicting policies that weakened collective resistance while providing opportunities for enemy exploitation. The lack of centralized command structure that had previously been a source of flexibility became a fatal liability when circumstances required unified action. Economic disruption following the naval defeat accelerated the dissolution of Confederation control over distant territories. Southern colonies found themselves cut off from homeland support while facing increasingly confident Greek opponents who sought to capitalize on their victory through expanded territorial demands. Commercial relationships that had sustained prosperity for generations collapsed as trade routes fell under enemy control. Fragmentation within the Confederation intensified as individual centers focused on protecting their immediate interests rather than maintaining collective resistance to external pressure. Some rulers sought separate accommodations with Greek authorities, hoping to preserve their positions through diplomatic submission rather than continued armed resistance. Others pursued alliance relationships with Celtic tribes or other potential partners who might provide support against common enemies. The loss of southern territories represented more than battlefield defeat. It marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in Mediterranean relationships that would ultimately determine the fate of Confederation independence. Greek success at Cumae encouraged further challenges to Confederation authority, while demonstrating that coordinated resistance could overcome even the most formidable opponents. Cultural consequences of the southern reversals proved as significant as immediate governmental and economic impacts. The Confederation's reputation for invincibility and cultural sophistication suffered irreparable damage that affected diplomatic relationships throughout the known world. Potential allies began questioning the wisdom of association with a declining league, while enemies gained confidence that sustained pressure could achieve decisive results. The period following Cumae witnessed accelerating territorial losses that revealed the empire's underlying instability. Colonies that had remained loyal through decades of growth began seeking independence or alternative protection as Confederation weakness became apparent. Local populations who had accepted foreign rule during times of prosperity increasingly viewed it as an intolerable burden that prevented pursuit of their own interests. Internal economic problems compounded the challenges posed by external pressure. The costs of maintaining defensive units against multiple threats exceeded available resources, while lost territories reduced the tax base needed to support continued resistance. Trade disruption eliminated commercial profits that had previously enabled territorial administration and operations. Administrative systems that had functioned effectively during periods of growth proved inadequate for managing decline and defensive warfare. The Confederation's decentralized structure, which had enabled rapid territorial acquisition, prevented the coordinated responses necessary for resisting determined opposition. Individual centers pursued contradictory policies that weakened collective resistance while providing opportunities for enemy exploitation. Diplomatic isolation compounded these difficulties as former allies distanced themselves from the declining Confederation. Commercial partners sought alternative relationships that offered better prospects for mutual benefit. Tributary populations began exploring independence or alignment with emerging powers that might provide more effective protection. The transformation of the Seven Hills settlement from subject colony to independent republic represented a particular blow to Confederation prestige and practical capability. The loss of their most strategically important possession demonstrated weakness while providing an alternative model of governance that appealed to populations throughout Confederation territories. The success of the revolutionary experiment encouraged similar movements elsewhere, while depriving the League of essential resources and strategic positions. Cultural changes accompanied these territorial and economic losses. The Confederation's influence on artistic and intellectual development declined. Greek cultural models gained prestige, while Confederation traditions appeared increasingly provincial and outdated. Educational systems, architectural styles, and literary forms that had once spread Confederation influence throughout the known world now seemed backward compared to classical alternatives. By the end of this period, the Confederation retained control over its central homeland, but had lost most of the extended territories that had made it a major Mediterranean authority. The experiment in the Seven Hills had survived its initial challenges and was beginning to develop the martial capabilities and governmental institutions that would enable future conquest. The stage was set for the next phase of this remarkable story: the gradual decline of Confederation influence and the rise of new powers that would ultimately transform the entire ancient world. The golden age of the League was ending, though its cultural achievements and institutional innovations would continue influencing human development for centuries to come. The kingdoms that had once commanded respect throughout the Mediterranean world were entering a period of fragmentation and decline that would test their ability to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving the distinctive characteristics that had made their civilization unique. The upheavals unleashed by the revolutionary experiment and the southern reversals would prove impossible to contain within existing frameworks. New authorities were emerging that would challenge not just Confederation territorial control, but the fundamental assumptions about governance, strategy, and cultural development that had governed Mediterranean civilization for centuries. The next chapter would bring even greater challenges that would determine whether the remarkable culture that had emerged from volcanic hills could survive the consequences of its own success. The 4th century BC brought cascading disasters that would shatter the ancient League forever. From the north, Gallic warriors descended from alpine passes with iron swords and fierce battle cries. From the south, the armies of the Seven Hills, no longer subjects but conquerors, methodically dismantled regions that had been ruled from palaces for centuries. Between these grinding pressures, the civilization that had once dominated the peninsula found itself fighting for survival on multiple fronts. Internal fragmentation had reached critical levels by the dawn of this devastating century. The 12 centers that had once coordinated their policies through sacred assemblies at Voltumna now pursued independent strategies that often conflicted with collective interests. Veii jealously guarded its control over salt production along the Tiber. Tarquinia focused on maintaining its coastal trade networks. Volterra concentrated on protecting its mountain copper mines. This parochial thinking prevented unified responses to external threats that required coordinated action. The economic foundations of prosperity began crumbling as trade networks collapsed and territorial losses reduced tax revenues. Silver mines in the northern hills fell under tribal control. Southern agricultural estates were seized by Greek colonists or local populations seeking independence. Coastal ports faced increasing raids by pirates who recognized that weakened naval patrols could no longer guarantee merchant safety. Competition between individual centers for scarce resources intensified existing rivalries while preventing the cooperation necessary for survival. Border disputes that had once been resolved through arbitration at religious festivals now escalated into armed conflicts that depleted manpower needed for external defense. Agricultural regions changed hands repeatedly as communities fought over fertile valleys and strategic river crossings. The warrior culture that had enabled territorial conquest during previous centuries proved inadequate for warfare against multiple enemies, employing different tactical systems. Traditional heavy infantry formations designed for set-piece battles struggled against Gallic mobility and hit-and-run tactics. Siege techniques developed for attacking Greek fortifications failed when applied to tribal hill forts designed according to different principles. Professional armies that had once inspired fear throughout the Mediterranean world found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by enemies who combined superior motivation with innovative tactics. Mercenary units recruited from throughout the known world proved unreliable when facing determined opposition that threatened their employers' ability to pay promised wages. Citizen militias lacked the training and equipment necessary for sustained campaigns against experienced opponents. The Gallic invasions that began around 400 BC represented an entirely new type of threat that exposed fundamental weaknesses in planning. Unlike the organized armies of Greek city-states or the disciplined legions emerging from the Seven Hills, Gallic warbands operated according to tribal customs that emphasized individual prowess, psychological intimidation, and rapid movement rather than coordinated group tactics. Gallic society north of the Alps had undergone significant transformation during the previous centuries through contact with Mediterranean civilizations and internal demographic pressures. Population growth in traditional homelands had produced land shortages that encouraged migration southward toward the fertile plains of northern Italy. Improved metalworking techniques had generated superior weapons and tools that enhanced both agricultural productivity and martial capability. The social organization of Gallic tribes differed markedly from the urban civilizations they encountered in Italy. Warrior aristocrats commanded personal followings based on kinship, oath-bound loyalty, and demonstrated courage, rather than territorial control or administrative position. These leaders could mobilize substantial forces for raiding expeditions, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for rapid movement across varied terrain. Gallic warfare emphasized shock tactics designed to break enemy morale through terrifying displays of ferocity and supernatural protection. Warriors painted their bodies with blue dye extracted from woad plants, braided their hair into intimidating styles, decorated with lime paste, and charged into battle while screaming war cries intended to paralyze opponents with fear. Their weapons included long, slashing swords designed for mounted combat, decorative shields that doubled as offensive weapons, and javelins that could penetrate armor at considerable distances. The psychological dimension of Gallic tactics proved particularly devastating against forces accustomed to the disciplined formations and predictable strategies employed by Mediterranean opponents. Traditional systems based on fortified positions and coordinated infantry movements could not counter enemies who appeared suddenly from forest cover, struck with devastating impact, then disappeared before organized responses could be mounted. The invasion route through Alpine passes brought Gallic warbands directly into the Po Valley, where prosperous settlements had grown wealthy through agricultural production and trade with regions south of the Apennines. These communities possessed substantial resources, but lacked the preparations necessary to resist determined assault by mobile enemies operating according to unfamiliar tactical principles. Melpum, one of the wealthiest centers in the northern lands, fell to Gallic assault around 396 BC after a siege that demonstrated both the attacker's persistence and the defender's inability to mount successful resistance. The city's capture provided enormous quantities of gold, silver, and luxury goods that financed further advance while demonstrating to other Gallic tribes the potential rewards available through southern migration. The sack of Melpum sent shockwaves throughout the League as communities that had considered themselves secure behind mountain barriers realized their vulnerability to northern invasion. Refugees fleeing Gallic advances brought reports of systematic destruction and population displacement that indicated the invaders intended permanent settlement rather than temporary raiding expeditions. Gallic settlement patterns in conquered regions reflected their tribal organization and pastoral economy. Unlike Mediterranean civilizations that concentrated populations in urban centers, Gallic communities dispersed across the landscape in small villages surrounded by agricultural fields and grazing areas. This decentralized occupation made it difficult for remaining forces to mount counterattacks, while ensuring that Gallic control extended throughout occupied areas. Cultural synthesis between Gallic settlers and existing populations produced hybrid societies that combined elements from both traditions. Gallic metalworking techniques improved local production capabilities, while Mediterranean agricultural methods increased food production in areas previously considered marginal. Religious practices incorporated deities from both pantheons, while maintaining distinctive ceremonial traditions. The linguistic impact of Gallic settlement proved particularly significant for long-term cultural development. Gallic languages belonged to the Indo-European family that also included Latin and Greek, making communication and cultural exchange easier than had been possible with the isolated tongue of the original inhabitants. This linguistic compatibility facilitated intermarriage and cultural blending that gradually transformed the ethnic composition of northern regions. Simultaneously, pressure from the south intensified as the settlement on Seven Hills developed the administrative systems and tactical innovations necessary for sustained territorial conquest. The early republic had survived its initial challenges through desperate efforts, but by the late 4th century, it possessed the resources and expertise needed for offensive operations that would systematically dismember the remaining domains. The siege of the great northern stronghold, beginning around 406 BC, represented the most serious external threat any major center had faced since the Persian invasions of Greece a century earlier. This 10-year struggle demonstrated both the tactical evolution that had transformed the armies of the Seven Hills and the institutional weaknesses that prevented successful resistance to sustained pressure. The city's strategic position, controlling Tiber crossings and salt production, made it an essential target for any authority seeking to dominate central Italy. Its massive fortifications, encompassing over 400 hectares within walls constructed from perfectly fitted stone blocks, had previously seemed impregnable to any conceivable assault. Underground cisterns provided water supplies capable of sustaining the population through extended sieges, while granaries contained food reserves accumulated over generations. The attacking armies commanded by Marcus Furius Camillus represented innovations in siege warfare that overcame traditional advantages through technological superiority and systematic planning. Engineering corps excavated tunnels beneath the city walls, while maintaining trenches that prevented relief expeditions from breaking the blockade. Specialized equipment included improved battering rams, torsion artillery, and siege towers that enabled assault troops to reach wall tops despite concentrated fire. More significantly, the siege demonstrated organizational capabilities that enabled sustained operations over multiple campaign seasons. Supply systems maintained adequate provisions for thousands of soldiers throughout the 10-year blockade. Rotation schedules allowed experienced units to return home for agricultural duties, while fresh troops maintained continuous pressure on the defenders. Financial arrangements provided regular pay for professional soldiers, whose service extended far beyond traditional campaigning periods. The League's inability to organize relief for the besieged stronghold revealed the fatal weakness of their decentralized system when confronting determined opponents capable of sustained effort. Individual centers pursued conflicting policies based on their immediate interests rather than collective strategic requirements. Some rulers sought accommodation with the attackers through separate negotiations. Others attempted military assistance that proved inadequate due to poor coordination and conflicting objectives. Religious factors complicated responses to the crisis, as traditional divination practices provided contradictory guidance about appropriate actions. Different centers' priests interpreted omens according to local preferences rather than collective strategic needs. Sacred obligations that had once unified policy now became sources of division as communities disagreed about proper ritual procedures and divine intentions. The final assault employed innovative tactics that bypassed the city's strongest positions through underground infiltration. Engineers had secretly excavated tunnels that reached beneath the central temple, where defenders had concentrated their most valuable possessions and sacred objects. Simultaneous attacks from multiple directions prevented coordinated resistance while enabling the capture of strategic positions before countermeasures could be organized. The city's fall in 396 BC marked a turning point in history that contemporaries recognized as catastrophic. The destruction eliminated one of the 12 sacred centers, while demonstrating that even the strongest positions could be overcome by determined opponents, employing superior organization and innovative tactics. The precedent encouraged further attacks on remaining domains, while discouraging potential allies who might otherwise have provided assistance. Population displacement following the conquest had profound demographic consequences that weakened resistance throughout central Italy. Survivors fled to other centers, straining resources and creating social tensions in communities already struggling with economic difficulties. Skilled craftsmen and experienced administrators who might have contributed to efforts were killed, enslaved, or forced into exile. The territorial redistribution that followed provided land for citizens from the Seven Hills, while eliminating agricultural production that had previously supported economic networks. Fertile fields that had generated surpluses for centuries now served the interests of a different system whose growth threatened remaining domains. Strategic positions that had controlled trade routes and passages fell under hostile control. Cultural destruction accompanied territorial conquest, as sacred sites were converted to serve different religious traditions, and artistic treasures were carried off as victory monuments. The famous Apollo was transported to ornament temples in the expanding Republic, symbolizing both the transfer of cultural prestige and the systematic dismantling of spiritual authority. Economic consequences of the fall reverberated throughout remaining domains, as trade networks collapsed and commercial partnerships dissolved. Merchants who had conducted business with the fallen city found themselves without reliable trading partners, while facing increased competition from commercial interests aligned with the expanding republic. Banking relationships that had facilitated long-distance commerce for generations became worthless, as instability made contract enforcement impossible. The psychological impact proved equally devastating, as the aura of invincibility that had sustained diplomacy for centuries disappeared with the demonstration that their strongest centers could be systematically conquered by determined opponents. Tributary populations throughout the regions began questioning the wisdom of continued loyalty to a declining authority, while potential allies reconsidered the strategic value of traditional partnerships. Internal conflicts within remaining centers intensified, as different factions advocated conflicting responses to the external threats. Aristocratic families with traditional ties to ancient institutions favored continued resistance despite mounting evidence of military inadequacy. Merchant classes increasingly supported accommodation with emerging powers that offered better prospects for commercial prosperity. Common citizens faced the immediate pressures of military service and economic disruption that made abstract loyalties seem less important than personal survival. Religious authority that had provided unity during previous crises began fragmenting as traditional divination practices failed to provide guidance for unprecedented circumstances. Priests trained in ancient procedures found themselves unable to interpret omens relevant to tactical situations outside their experience. Sacred books that had preserved centuries of accumulated wisdom offered no precedence for the systematic territorial conquest that was dismantling their civilization. Administrative systems developed for governing prosperous regions during periods of growth proved inadequate for managing decline and warfare. Tax collection became increasingly difficult as territorial losses reduced revenue sources, while military expenses consumed available resources. Legal procedures that had maintained order during peaceful times broke down as communities prioritized immediate survival over long-term institutional stability. Diplomatic isolation compounded these internal difficulties as former allies distanced themselves from the declining league. Commercial partners sought alternative relationships that offered better prospects for mutual benefit. Tributary populations explored independence or alignment with emerging powers that might provide more protection than the weakening traditional authorities. The gradual Latinization of elite culture reflected both practical accommodation to changing circumstances and genuine attraction to the cultural achievements of the expanding republic. Aristocratic families began adopting Latin names, Roman architectural styles, and Mediterranean educational practices that offered their children better opportunities in the emerging environment. Intermarriage between nobility and families from the Seven Hills accelerated cultural assimilation while creating kinship networks that transcended boundaries. These relationships provided mechanisms for peaceful territorial transfer, while enabling elites to maintain social status within the expanding system. Some aristocratic families successfully transitioned from traditional leadership to provincial administration under Roman authority. Military adaptation proved more difficult as traditional tactical systems based on individual prowess and religious inspiration proved inadequate against disciplined formations, employing coordinated tactics and superior equipment. Attempts to adopt Roman military organization failed due to insufficient resources and incompatible cultural values that emphasized personal honor over collective discipline. Economic transformation accelerated as remaining domains were gradually integrated into the expanding Roman commercial system. Traditional industries that had served local markets found themselves competing with mass production facilities located closer to major population centers. Agricultural estates that had generated prosperity for centuries were consolidated into larger units employing slave labor rather than free peasants. Technological stagnation reflected the broader cultural decline as traditional centers of learning and innovation lost the resources necessary to support continued development. Metalworking techniques that had once been the most advanced in the Mediterranean world fell behind innovations developed in Greek workshops and Roman armories. Architectural projects that had once demonstrated engineering prowess were abandoned due to lack of funding and skilled craftsmen. Cultural preservation efforts by traditional elites reflected both genuine devotion to ancestral customs and recognition that cultural distinctiveness might provide the only remaining source of identity and status. Tomb paintings continued depicting traditional scenes of banqueting and religious ceremony, even as the social reality they represented disappeared. Religious festivals maintained ancient ritual requirements despite declining participation and reduced resources. Educational systems that had once transmitted specialized knowledge about divination, law, and administration struggled to maintain relevance as traditional institutions lost authority and influence. Young aristocrats increasingly sought education in Greek philosophy and Roman law, rather than the ancient learning that no longer provided practical advantages. The linguistic isolation that had once marked cultural distinctiveness became a barrier to advancement in the new environment. By 300 BC, the ancient league retained control over only a fraction of its original domains, while facing continued pressure from multiple directions. Gallic settlement in the north had permanently altered the demographic composition of the Po Valley. Roman growth from the south had eliminated several of the 12 sacred centers, while reducing others to tributary status. Internal conflicts and economic difficulties prevented resistance to these external pressures. The stage was set for the final phase of independence as the remaining centers struggled to preserve their distinctive culture while adapting to the realities of subordination to more powerful neighbors. The next century would determine whether the remarkable civilization that had emerged from volcanic hills could survive as a distinct entity or would be completely absorbed into the expanding systems that had emerged from its own achievements. The transformation of the Mediterranean world that expansion had initiated was approaching completion, though in directions that none of the original participants could have anticipated. The cultural innovations, institutions, and technological developments that had enabled success were now serving the interests of different peoples whose ambitions would reshape the entire ancient world. The final 2 centuries of independence witnessed the inexorable transformation of a once proud civilization into provincial appendages of an expanding republic. What had begun as military conquest evolved into systematic assimilation that would erase the autonomy of the ancient cities while preserving fragments of their distinctive traditions within the framework of republican administration. This process unfolded not through dramatic battles, but through the gradual erosion of institutions, languages, and customs that had defined a unique way of life for nearly a millennium. The 3rd century BC opened with the remnants of the ancient League, facing an impossible strategic situation. Armies from the 7 hills controlled the southern approaches to their homeland, while Gallic settlements dominated the northern plains. Celtic warbands continued raiding from mountain strongholds, while colonists from the expanding republic established permanent settlements on confiscated agricultural estates. Between these pressures, the surviving cities found themselves isolated from each other and increasingly dependent on republican goodwill for their continued existence. Tarquinia, once the most powerful member of the Sacred 12, exemplified the challenges facing ancestral authorities during this period of accelerating decline. The coastal city retained control over its immediate hinterland and maintained profitable trading relationships with Mediterranean partners. But its influence over neighboring settlements had evaporated with the collapse of the League's coordinated policies. Internal struggles between aristocratic families weakened unified responses to external pressures, while creating opportunities for diplomatic intervention from the expanding republic. The approach to territorial integration during this period demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the psychological and administrative challenges involved in governing diverse populations. Rather than imposing uniform systems across conquered regions, administrators adapted their methods to circumstances while gradually introducing standardized practices that would facilitate long-term assimilation. This flexible strategy proved far more successful than the brutal suppression techniques employed by earlier powers. Individual treaties negotiated between the Republic and surviving cities reflected this nuanced approach to expansion. Each agreement addressed specific circumstances while establishing precedents that would govern future relationships throughout the peninsula. Some settlements received favorable terms in exchange for military cooperation against common enemies. Others faced harsh conditions due to previous resistance or strategic importance that required direct control. Saere, which had maintained friendly relations with the Republic since its early years, received the privileged status of civitas sine suffragio, citizenship without voting rights that provided legal protection and commercial advantages while preserving autonomy in internal affairs. This arrangement enabled aristocratic families to maintain their social position while participating in the expanding economy through business partnerships and marriage alliances with citizens of the Republic. The legal innovations represented by these varied citizenship categories would profoundly influence the development of administration throughout the Mediterranean world. The concept of graduated citizenship rights enabled the integration of diverse populations while maintaining incentives for loyalty and cooperation. Elite families could aspire to full citizenship through demonstrated service while retaining connections to their ancestral settlements. Volterra's resistance to expansion illustrated both the desperate measures attempted by ancestral authorities and the futility of military opposition against superior organization and resources. The mountain cities' siege defenses, strengthened through generations of warfare against neighboring rivals, proved inadequate against engineering capabilities and systematic siege techniques. The 2-year blockade that ended in 298 BC demonstrated that even the strongest fortifications could be overcome through patient application of superior resources. The aftermath of Volterra's conquest revealed policies toward recalcitrant populations that combined severity with pragmatic accommodation. The city's walls were demolished and its treasury confiscated, but the population remained in place under Republican administration. Agricultural estates were redistributed to provide land for colonists, while existing inhabitants retained smaller holdings that enabled economic survival. This balanced approach prevented the depopulation that had characterized earlier conquests, while ensuring control over strategic positions. Transformation accompanied integration as ancestral institutions adapted to administrative requirements while preserving ceremonial functions that maintained community identity. Religious festivals continued under Republican oversight, though with modifications that eliminated practices incompatible with law or public order. Priestly families retained responsibility for maintaining ancestral shrines, while accepting supervision by magistrates who ensured compliance with policies. The linguistic changes that occurred during this period reflected the gradual but irreversible transformation of identity throughout the former League territories. Latin became the language of official administration, legal proceedings, and commercial transactions, while the ancient tongue retreated into domestic contexts and religious ceremonies. Bilingual inscriptions from this period show the transition in progress, with ancestral formulas gradually giving way to Latin equivalents. Educational systems that had once transmitted specialized knowledge about divination, law, and administration were restructured to prepare young aristocrats for careers within the Republican system. Greek philosophy and jurisprudence replaced ancestral learning as subjects essential for social advancement. The ancient schools that had preserved centuries of accumulated wisdom closed for lack of students and resources, while new institutions focused on practical skills needed for administration. Economic integration proceeded through the systematic incorporation of ancestral industries into commercial networks. The metalworking cities that had once supplied luxury goods to Mediterranean markets found themselves competing with mass production facilities located closer to major population centers. Some workshops adapted by specializing in high-quality products for wealthy customers, while others disappeared as their markets were captured by more efficient competitors. Agricultural transformation reflected both administrative efficiency and the demographic changes that accompanied territorial integration. Large estates worked by slave gangs replaced the small family farms that had characterized ancestral agricultural organization. This consolidation increased productivity while reducing the rural population that had previously supported the independence of settlements. Former peasant farmers migrated to urban areas where they worked as craftsmen or laborers, while losing their connection to the land that had defined their ancestors' identity. The social war that erupted in 91 BC represented the culmination of decades of growing tension between citizens of the Republic and their Italian allies, who had contributed military service and economic support to expansion, while being denied the rights and legal protections that citizenship provided. The remaining cities found themselves caught between their desire for equal treatment and their fear of losing the limited autonomy they still retained under the existing system. The causes of this conflict reflected fundamental contradictions in policy that had developed during the previous century of territorial expansion. Italian settlements had provided soldiers for armies, resources for public works, and markets for commerce, while receiving minimal compensation for their contributions. The wealth generated by conquest flowed primarily to citizens, while the costs and risks were shared with allies who possessed no voice in decisions that affected their vital interests. Aristocratic families from ancestral cities played prominent roles in the rebellion that sought to establish an independent Italian federation capable of challenging hegemony throughout the peninsula. These leaders possessed both the resources necessary for sustained military operations and the connections required to coordinate resistance among diverse settlements, with conflicting interests and historical grievances. The war's initial phases demonstrated that military supremacy was not as overwhelming as previous easy victories had suggested when facing determined opposition from populations familiar with tactical methods and administrative weaknesses. Italian forces achieved significant successes through their knowledge of terrain and their ability to exploit the social tensions that expansion had created within Republican society itself. However, the strategic disadvantages facing the rebels became apparent as the conflict continued beyond the initial campaign seasons. Control over major population centers and transportation networks enabled the Republic to maintain supply lines while disrupting rebel communications. More significantly, diplomatic flexibility enabled offers of concessions that divided opponents and undermined the unity necessary for sustained resistance. The Senate's decision to grant citizenship rights to settlements that remained loyal, while promising similar treatment to rebels who surrendered, transformed the conflict from a war of independence into a negotiation over the terms of integration. This strategy proved devastatingly effective in isolating the most determined rebels, while providing face-saving alternatives for settlements that preferred accommodation to continued warfare. The war's conclusion in 88 BC marked the end of any realistic possibility that ancestral institutions could maintain independence within the Republican system. The grant of citizenship to all Italian settlements eliminated the legal distinctions that had preserved autonomy, while providing the rights that had been the rebels' primary objective. This solution satisfied immediate grievances, while ensuring that future resistance would lack the legal justification that had motivated the original rebellion. The administrative integration that followed the social war completed the transformation of the ancient cities from independent entities into municipal components of the Republic. Magistrates retained responsibility for routine governance, while answering to governors who supervised major policy decisions. This system preserved the appearance of self-government, while ensuring control over strategic and financial matters. Legal assimilation proceeded through the gradual replacement of ancestral law codes with principles that provided uniform standards throughout the peninsula. Customs that were compatible with Republican practice continued under supervision, while incompatible traditions were either modified or eliminated. This process preserved some distinctive elements, while creating the legal uniformity necessary for efficient administration. The consequences of citizenship proved more complex and contradictory than either administrators or leaders had anticipated. Legal equality provided opportunities for social advancement that enabled talented individuals to achieve prominence within the republican system, while weakening their connection to ancestral settlements. The most successful families often relocated to the capital itself, where their skills and resources could be employed more profitably than in provincial settings. Religious integration followed similar patterns, as ancestral deities were identified with republican counterparts, while distinctive ritual practices were either adapted to requirements or relegated to private observance. The great temple complexes that had once served as centers of authority became tourist attractions that preserved memory while serving no practical function in contemporary society. Artistic traditions that had once expressed distinctive values were transformed into decorative elements that appealed to collectors interested in exotic antiquities rather than living expressions. The tomb paintings that had depicted vibrant social life became historical curiosities studied by scholars rather than meaningful statements about contemporary values and aspirations. Economic specialization within the republican system created new opportunities for settlements that could adapt their ancestral skills to market demands, while eliminating the independence that had enabled innovation during previous centuries. Metalworking centers that produced standardized military equipment or luxury goods for customers prospered while maintaining technical excellence. Agricultural regions that supplied specific products to urban markets achieved commercial success while losing the diversified economy that had supported autonomy. The linguistic transformation that accompanied integration reflected the practical advantages of Latin literacy in a society where advancement depended on participation in republican institutions. The ancient tongue retreated into domestic contexts and religious ceremonies, while losing the vocabulary necessary to express contemporary concepts and concerns. By the 1st century BC, inscriptions in the ancestral language had become rare even in heartlands, where the spoken language persisted among older generations. Educational changes that prepared young aristocrats for careers within the republican system eliminated the ancestral learning that had distinguished elites from their Mediterranean contemporaries. Knowledge of law, Greek philosophy, and administration replaced expertise in divination, ancient history, and customs. These changes enabled social advancement, while severing connections to traditions that had defined community identity for centuries. Marriage patterns that had once reinforced alliances and solidarity increasingly connected aristocratic families with citizens and other Italian settlements that offered better prospects for social advancement. These relationships facilitated assimilation while weakening the kinship networks that had maintained ancestral authority structures. Some families achieved remarkable success within the republican system while losing their connection to ancestral settlements. The demographic changes that accompanied urbanization and economic transformation altered the social foundations that had supported ancient culture throughout the countryside. Rural populations that migrated to expanding cities adopted urban customs and Latin speech, while losing the agricultural lifestyle that had preserved ancestral traditions. The countryside itself was transformed by large-scale agricultural operations that employed slave labor rather than the free peasant families that had maintained continuity across generations. By 90 BC, the independence that had enabled the ancient cities to develop their distinctive civilization had been completely eliminated through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic accommodation, and assimilation. The grant of citizenship provided legal equality, while ensuring that ancestral institutions would function only within the framework of republican administration. Autonomy in routine matters preserved the appearance of self-government, while real authority rested with officials accountable to republican rather than interests. The transformation was so complete that resistance to republican authority became virtually impossible to organize or justify. Legal channels existed for addressing grievances, while military options had been eliminated through the destruction of independent military capabilities. Distinctiveness persisted in religious ceremonies, artistic traditions, and domestic customs, while losing any significance that might threaten republican stability. The stage was set for the final chapter of this remarkable story. As the ancient civilization that had once ruled the Seven Hills itself became a collection of prosperous provincial municipalities within the expanding republic, the distinctive culture that had emerged from volcanic hills would survive in modified forms, while the institutions and social systems that had created it disappeared into the administrative machinery of republican government. The irony of this transformation was that the very success of republican administration in integrating diverse populations while preserving customs enabled elements of the ancient culture to survive and influence the development of institutions. The religious practices, artistic techniques, and administrative methods that had characterized the ancient civilization continued to shape republican culture long after independence had been eliminated. In losing their autonomy, the ancient cities had gained a form of immortality through their contribution to the republican system that would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. Though the last independent king had fallen, and the final city-state had surrendered its autonomy to republican administration, the ancient people that had emerged from volcanic hills left an indelible mark on human history that would endure long after its creators had vanished into the administrative machinery of empire. The influence of this remarkable society permeated every aspect of the culture that succeeded them, from the sacred rituals performed on the Capitoline Hill to the engineering marvels that would span continents, from the governmental institutions that would govern millions to the artistic heritage that would inspire Renaissance masters 15 centuries later. The inheritance that flowed from Etruria to the expanding republic encompassed far more than simple territorial acquisition or economic resources. When ambitious politicians from the Seven Hills donned purple-striped togas and ivory-handled fasces, they clothed themselves in symbols of authority whose origins lay deep in the spiritual customs of the people they had conquered. The very concept of imperium, supreme governmental power, derived from beliefs about the divine sanction necessary for legitimate rule over human affairs. Spiritual practices that had evolved over centuries in hilltop temples found new expression in the expanding republic's ceremonial life, while losing their connection to the independence that had originally defined them. The complex science of augury became central to decision-making processes that would determine the fate of nations. Before any significant undertaking, military campaigns, colonial foundations, or major construction projects, trained specialists observed the flight patterns of birds, interpreted lightning strikes, and examined sacrificial victims' entrails according to procedures codified in ancient texts, whose origins were already forgotten by those who employed them. The haruspices, who practiced liver divination, represented perhaps the most distinctive contribution of ancient spirituality to subsequent Mediterranean worship. These specialists underwent decades of training to master the complex interpretive frameworks that correlated anatomical features with divine intentions. Their bronze models, inscribed with detailed diagrams showing the correspondence between organ sections and celestial regions, provided reference materials for practitioners whose services remained essential to governmental and military planning throughout the Republican and early imperial periods. The triumph ceremony that celebrated military victory combined spiritual concepts with theatrical display in ways that became central to the political culture of the expanding state. The victorious general, his face painted red in imitation of divine statues, rode through cheering crowds while a slave whispered reminders of mortality, a ritual acknowledgement that human achievement required divine sanction and remained subject to supernatural judgment. The purple robe, golden crown, and ivory scepter that marked the triumphator's temporary elevation to near-divine status, all derived from royal regalia whose symbolic significance transcended their material value. Gladiatorial games, which would become synonymous with entertainment throughout the empire, originated in funeral practices that honored deceased aristocrats through combat between armed warriors. These ritualized battles served sacred purposes that connected the living with ancestral spirits while demonstrating the social status of families wealthy enough to sponsor elaborate memorial ceremonies. The transformation of sacred obligations into public spectacles reflected broader changes in spiritual sensibility while preserving elements of the original ceremonial framework. Architectural innovations that had enabled engineers to construct temples, drainage systems, and urban infrastructure provided technical foundations for the building projects that would reshape the Mediterranean world. The arch, though known in earlier societies, was refined and popularized by architects whose structural innovations enabled the construction of spanning structures previously considered impossible. The Cloaca Maxima, which drained marshland between hills, employed engineering principles established through centuries of hydraulic projects in ancient territories. Temple design customs established distinctive proportional relationships and decorative programs that influenced sacred architecture throughout the expanding territories. The characteristic three-room layout reflected theological principles about divine triads, while providing functional spaces for ceremonial activities and administrative functions. The use of terracotta decoration enabled more colorful and elaborate ornamentation than stone construction allowed, while demonstrating artistic capabilities that impressed visitors from throughout the known world. Urban planning concepts that integrated practical requirements with sacred obligations shaped the growth of cities throughout Italy and beyond. The systematic surveying procedures used to establish proper orientation for temples, streets, and public buildings derived from beliefs about the correspondence between human settlements and cosmic order. The pomerium, sacred boundary that defined urban space, became a legal and ceremonial institution that regulated expansion while maintaining spiritual protection for inhabitants. Legal concepts that had evolved through centuries of jurisprudence influenced the creation of Roman law in ways that would affect legal systems throughout Western society. The principle of written law, accessible to citizens rather than arbitrary royal decree, reflected constitutional customs that balanced monarchical authority with aristocratic privileges and popular participation. Procedures for legal testimony, contract enforcement, and property rights incorporated precedents while adapting them to changing social and economic conditions. Commercial practices that had enabled merchants to establish trading networks throughout the Mediterranean world provided models for the economic policies that would finance imperial expansion. Banking techniques, currency standards, and international agreements established during centuries of commercial activity influenced the institutional frameworks that would govern trade relationships spanning 3 continents. The commercial law that regulated transactions between different legal systems incorporated principles originally formed to facilitate exchange between ancient cities and foreign partners. Military innovations that had enabled armies to dominate Italian territories for centuries influenced tactical advancement and organizational reform throughout the Republican period. The manipular system that proved so effective in subsequent conquests adapted flexible formations to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining the discipline necessary for coordinated operations. Engineering techniques created for siege warfare provided capabilities that would prove essential during campaigns against fortified positions throughout the Mediterranean world. Artistic heritage that had flourished in ancient workshops influenced aesthetic progress throughout the territories, while providing technical knowledge that enhanced decorative arts and monumental sculpture. Bronze working methods that had produced masterpieces like the Capitoline Wolf and the Chimera of Arezzo established standards of technical excellence that subsequent craftsmen would strive to match. The realistic portraiture that characterized ancient sculpture influenced the growth of individualized representation that would become central to imperial artistic programs. Wall painting techniques that had decorated aristocratic tombs with scenes of banqueting, athletic competition, and ceremony provided models for the decorative programs that would ornament public buildings and private residences throughout the expanding territories. The narrative compositions and naturalistic details that characterized the best ancient painting influenced artistic progress while preserving visual records of social customs and values that would otherwise have been lost. The preservation of ancient memory became increasingly important as the original population was assimilated into the expanding republican system. Aristocratic families that had successfully transitioned to Roman citizenship often maintained interest in their ancestral heritage through the collection of antiquities, the preservation of family records, and the patronage of scholars who studied ancient customs and ceremonial practices. These efforts helped maintain awareness of contributions to contemporary culture, while adapting historical memory to serve new political and social requirements. Literary works that described ancient history and customs provided information about the vanished society while reflecting the biases and interests of their authors. Roman historians like Livy incorporated material into their narratives of early Italian progress, while emphasizing themes of moral decline and political corruption that served contemporary ideological purposes. These accounts preserved valuable information while interpreting it according to standards that often distorted the original context. The gradual decline of the ancient language represented perhaps the most significant loss in the transmission of heritage from the vanished society to subsequent generations. By the 1st century BC, inscriptions in the ancestral tongue had become rare, even in original heartlands, where Latin had displaced the ancient language in most practical contexts. Ceremonial rites and family customs preserved some linguistic elements, while losing the vocabulary necessary to express complex concepts about law, philosophy, and contemporary affairs. Archaeological preservation varied significantly across different regions, depending on geological conditions, subsequent construction, and historical circumstances. The volcanic soil that had originally attracted settlement provided excellent preservation conditions for organic materials, while protecting buried structures from erosion and destruction. Tomb complexes carved into hillsides survived largely intact, while urban sites often suffered from continuous occupation and reconstruction that obscured earlier building phases. The spiritual transition that accompanied political integration gradually transformed ancient sacred sites into archaeological curiosities, rather than active centers of worship. Temple complexes that had served communities for centuries were abandoned as congregations adopted new practices or relocated to different areas. Sacred groves and natural shrines lost their ceremonial significance while retaining some importance as historical landmarks and tourist attractions. Christian attitudes toward ancient spiritual customs reflected broader theological concerns about pagan practices, while demonstrating selective appreciation for artistic and architectural achievements. Early Christian writers condemned divination and sacrificial rituals as demonic delusions, while acknowledging the engineering capabilities that had produced impressive hydraulic and architectural projects. This selective approach preserved some aspects of ancient heritage, while eliminating elements considered incompatible with Christian spirituality. Medieval interpretations of ancient remains often reflected contemporary political concerns rather than historical understanding of the original society. Local customs incorporated legendary material about ancient inhabitants into genealogical claims that supported territorial rights or aristocratic status. Ruins and artifacts were interpreted according to medieval assumptions about classical antiquity, while losing connection to their original context. The Renaissance rediscovery of the ancient people reflected both genuine scholarly interest and contemporary political needs for prestigious historical precedents. Italian city-states seeking to establish their independence from foreign domination found inspiration in the example of ancient peoples who had achieved sophistication and political autonomy before the rise of imperial systems. Humanist scholars who studied classical texts discovered references to achievements that had been overshadowed by Greek and Roman sources. Archaeological investigation during the Renaissance period focused primarily on the recovery of artistic treasures, rather than systematic understanding of historical progress. Wealthy collectors sponsored excavations that produced impressive bronzes, jewelry, and painted pottery, while paying little attention to architectural remains or ordinary domestic artifacts. This selective approach preserved some masterpieces while destroying contextual information that would have enabled better understanding of social organization and practices. The establishment of more systematic archaeological methods during the 18th and 19th centuries enabled scholars to begin reconstructing the ancient society through careful analysis of material remains rather than reliance on literary sources alone. Excavations at major sites like Tarquinia, Cerveteri, and Vulci revealed extensive tomb complexes decorated with paintings and filled with artifacts that provided unprecedented insights into ancient social customs, spiritual beliefs, and artistic achievements. The decipherment of ancient inscriptions proceeded slowly due to the language's isolation from known linguistic families and the limited vocabulary preserved in surviving texts. Scholars could identify personal names, place names, and some ceremonial formulae, while remaining unable to translate longer passages that might have provided information about historical events, legal procedures, or literary works. This linguistic barrier prevented full understanding of intellectual achievements while preserving their mysterious character that continued to fascinate subsequent generations. Modern archaeological techniques have revolutionized understanding of the ancient people through systematic excavation, scientific analysis, and interdisciplinary collaboration that combines textual studies with environmental archaeology, demographic analysis, and technological investigation. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery have revealed the extent of ancient settlements while minimizing destructive excavation. Chemical analysis of artifacts has provided information about trade relationships, manufacturing techniques, and dietary practices that would have been impossible to determine through older methods. DNA analysis of skeletal remains has begun to address questions about origins that have puzzled scholars since antiquity. The genetic evidence suggests complex population dynamics involving both indigenous Italian advancement and immigration from eastern Mediterranean regions, supporting theories that emphasize synthesis rather than simple migration or autochthonous growth. These findings confirm the sophisticated nature of ancient Mediterranean population movements, while demonstrating the limitations of simple explanations for complex phenomena. The contemporary relevance of the ancient society extends beyond academic interest to encompass broader questions about identity, political autonomy, and the relationship between local customs and imperial systems. The experience of maintaining distinctive characteristics while adapting to changing political circumstances provides insights relevant to contemporary discussions about globalization, preservation, and the balance between unity and diversity in modern societies. Tourist initiatives in former territories have produced both opportunities and challenges for archaeological preservation, while generating economic benefits for local communities. Major museum collections in Rome, Florence, and specialized institutions like the Villa Giulia have made ancient artifacts accessible to international audiences, while supporting research programs that continue to expand understanding of the vanished society. Reconstruction projects at sites like Cerveteri and Tarquinia enable visitors to experience tomb paintings and architectural remains in their original context, while protecting fragile materials from environmental damage. Educational programs that introduce students to ancient history and culture serve broader goals of historical understanding, while demonstrating the complexity of ancient Mediterranean societies that extended far beyond the familiar narratives of Greek philosophy and Roman conquest. The ancient example illustrates how sophisticated societies could establish distinctive characteristics while participating in broader networks that connected diverse populations across vast geographical regions. The influence of ancient artistic heritage continues to inspire contemporary artists and designers who appreciate the technical excellence and aesthetic sophistication that characterized ancient workshops. The realistic portraiture, dynamic compositions, and decorative innovations that distinguished ancient art provide models for contemporary work, while demonstrating the continuity of human creative expression across temporal and geographical boundaries. Urban planning concepts that originated in ancient cities remain relevant to contemporary discussions about sustainable growth, community design, and the integration of ceremonial or spiritual spaces within functional urban environments. The ancient approach to balancing practical requirements with sacred obligations offers insights for planners seeking to create livable communities that serve both material needs and spiritual values. The legacy of the ancient people ultimately transcends the specific achievements of any particular historical period to encompass fundamental questions about human creativity, political organization, and transmission that remain relevant to contemporary societies. The remarkable people who emerged from volcanic hills produced institutions, artistic heritage, and technological innovations that influenced subsequent progress while preserving distinctive characteristics that continue to inspire admiration and study. Their story reminds us that sophisticated societies represent an ongoing process rather than a fixed achievement, requiring constant adaptation to changing circumstances while maintaining essential values and customs that define community identity. They succeeded in creating a sophisticated culture that balanced local autonomy with international engagement, individual achievement with social solidarity, and spiritual heritage with practical innovation, in ways that enabled them to thrive for nearly a millennium before their eventual absorption into larger imperial systems. The rediscovery and study of their achievements continue to enrich our understanding of human potential, while demonstrating that remarkable accomplishments can emerge from unexpected places and survive even the disappearance of the political systems that originally supported them. In losing their independence, the ancient people achieved a different form of immortality through their contributions to the heritage that continues to shape human experience throughout the world they once helped to create.